If you've ever faced a life-changing decision, if you believe that quiet choices are the hardest ones, like, share and subscribe to join Frontier Hearts, where stories of patience, dignity, and silent waiting still have a place. The train stopped at Dry Creek Station in Wyoming Territory one afternoon in 1882. Most passengers have disembarked. The sound of footsteps on the platform faded, then disappeared. Only the sound of the wind sweeping across the old wooden planks remained, and the heavy heartbeat of a woman still sitting in the last carriage. Her name was Abigail Monroe. Abigail sat upright on the long wooden bench, her hands resting on an old cloth bag nestled in her lap. Inside the bag was nothing of value: a few simple clothes, a thin, worn-edge Bible, and a few neatly folded letters, the careful handwriting of a man she knew only by the black ink on the paper. Out there on the platform, Jacob Harlan is waiting. He wasn't a man of many words. A seasoned cowboy, he'd been through war, suffered far more than he could tell. Jacob didn't know Abigail well. He only knew what he needed to know. She wrote neatly, thought carefully, and desired a stable life just like him. A simple promise. No flowery language, no vows. But Abigail couldn't bring herself to get off the ship. It wasn't because she was afraid of Jacob. It wasn't because she was afraid of the marriage that awaited her. She feared something para, fear that only those who have experienced loss can understand. If she steps off at that station, she will lose herself. When the name Abigail Monroe is replaced by the role of someone's wife, will the part of her that she tried to preserve throughout her lonely years still exist? She didn't cry, at least not yet. The train is about to blow its whistle. The ticket inspector will return. The carriage door will close, and then everything will end in the way fate often ends, silently, without giving any more time. To outsiders, this is just a stop along the way. But for Abigail, it was a point of no return in her life. And at the very moment when everyone thought the story would end there, where a woman didn't have the courage to step down, Jacob Harlan did something nobody expected. He didn't turn his back and leave. He walked against the flow of people. He climbed aboard the ship, and he chose to wait. Not to force, not to seize, but to avoid abandoning a person caught between fear and their own dignity. And that's when this story really begins. Jacob Harlan isn't the type of person who stands still and does nothing productive. For most of his life, he always knew what to do next. Get up before dawn, check on the horses, repair the fence, patrol the land, and return before dark. In war, he knew when to advance and when to retreat. On this harsh frontier, hesitation often meant a price to pay. But that afternoon at Dry Creek Station, Jacob stood still. He stood at the edge of the platform, his feet firmly planted on the weathered wooden planks. The train ahead was deflating, white smoke billowing up and then dissipating into the wind. The ticket inspector had begun packing up. The last few passengers hurried onward, afraid of being left behind. Only the last carriage remained silent. Jacob knew perfectly well that the woman he was waiting for hadn't come down yet. He didn't need anyone to tell him. There are things that experienced people understand just by looking, and Jacob Harlan had lived long enough to recognize a very special kind of silence, the silence of someone wondering if they have the strength to move on to another life. A man standing nearby spoke softly, his voice tinged with the familiar sympathy of the Mekong Delta. "Maybe she changed her mind. That's normal. Women are like that. You should go home." Jacob nodded very slightly, as if he had heard that phrase somewhere a long time ago. In this land, people are used to being left behind by winter, left behind by drought, left behind by unfulfilled promises. No one blames a woman for not getting on the ship. No one thinks it's worth bothering about. But Jacob didn't turn his back. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper folded in quarters, the passenger list. He had unfolded and folded it countless times during the days of waiting. His calloused fingers traced the lines of text slowly and carefully. Then he stopped. Abigail Monroe. The name is still there. Not crossed out, no notes. Not gone. Jacob took a deep breath. A very simple, very practical thought came to his mind, not a hunch, not blind hope, but something he had learned from a lifetime of observing people. Some people don't run away. They just haven't had enough courage to step down yet. The ticket inspector's whistle blew short, concise, emotionless. The engine vibrated slightly. The train prepared to depart, carrying with it all the unspoken words. Jacob knew that if he stood still it would all end here. No one blamed him. No one considered it a failure. He would return to the farm, continuing a peaceful but solitary life, a life he had long been accustomed to. But Jacob Harlan was a soldier. Not the bravest soldier nor a hero. He was just the kind of person who wouldn't leave when those around him were still there. There are habits that once deeply ingrained will stay with a person for life. Jacob boarded the train. No rush, no hesitation, just a very ordinary step but going against everyone else's lead. Inside the train carriage the atmosphere was strangely quiet. The wooden benches were empty. The setting sun shone obliquely through the windows, casting long streaks of light on the floor. Jacob took off his hat. It wasn't a habit. It was a very rare gesture, as if he were entering someone's private space where the roughness of the outside world shouldn't be present. He saw Abigail Monroe immediately. She sat near the window, her back straight but her shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to shrink herself. Her hands rested on her cloth bag, her fingers tightly intertwined. She didn't turn around. Perhaps she had heard footsteps. Perhaps she was afraid that if she turned, everything would become too real. Jacob stopped a few steps away from her, not close enough to exert pressure, not far enough to appear cold. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't prepared a speech. There were no accusations, nor was he expecting any explanation. For Jacob, waiting was never a sign of weakness. It was the only way he knew to show respect for a human being, especially when that person was standing at the brink of their own life. Abigail finally spoke, her voice low but not trembling. "You didn't need to come up here." Jacob shook his head very slightly. "I know," he said. His voice was low and slow, like someone who spoke little but spoke the truth. "I just wanted to make sure you're not here because you were forced." Abigail let out a soft laugh. Not a joyful laugh. It was more like a sound that had been held back for too long. "Nobody forced me," she replied. "I wrote the letter myself. I boarded the train myself. I came here on my own." She was silent for a moment. "But I'm not sure. Who am I anymore?" Those words fell to the train floor like a heavy object placed down very gently, not noisy but impossible to ignore. Jacob didn't interrupt. He didn't move forward. He didn't put his hand on her shoulder. He didn't say the familiar phrases like, "everything will be all right," because he understood that for those who had lost so much, those words often felt empty. He just stood there. And it was the fact that a man stood still and listened without trying to fix things that made Abigail lower her head. The tears came slowly, heavily, as if they themselves needed time to decide whether or not to fall. "I'm not afraid of you," she said very softly. "I'm afraid that if I step onto that platform, I'll become someone I won't even recognize myself." Jacob was silent for a long time. Then he said, his voice firm but not commanding, "You're not wrong to be afraid." Abigail looked up. "If she's not afraid," Jacob continued, "then perhaps that's what's worrying." He looked towards the carriage door where the light was fading, then turned back. "People often think courage is stepping off the train," he said. "But sometimes courage is daring to admit that you're not ready." The ship shook slightly. Time stands still for no one. But it doesn't force anyone either. And at that very moment, in the last carriage of a train about to leave the station, something very rare happened. Fear has been given its proper name, and therefore it is no longer in complete control. The ship hasn't started moving yet. The engine hummed steadily, like a breath held back, awaiting the final command. Outside, the wind blew harder, sweeping across the empty platform of Dry Creek Station, carrying dust and discarded scraps of paper. Everything seemed to be urging either go or stay. Time was running out. But in the last carriage, time seemed to pass differently. Abigail Monroe sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the space before her. Jacob's words did not echo or reverberate. They settled deeply like water seeping into dry earth. Courage isn't always about stepping off the train. She had heard so much advice in her life. From deceased loved ones, from society, from invisible voices saying a woman needs stability, needs a man, needs a place to belong. But no one had ever told her that not being ready is not cowardice. Abigail placed her hand on her chest. Her heart was still racing, but it was no longer erratic. The fear was still there, it hadn't disappeared, but it was no longer something that propelled her forward or pulled her back. It simply existed, to be looked at directly. Jacob Harlan remained standing a few steps away from her. He didn't stare, nor did he turn away. He stood there like a landmark, not to point the way, but to say if she stood there for another minute, she wouldn't be alone. "You don't have to," Abigail said after a long pause. Her voice was calmer than she had imagined. "You can get off the ship. No one will blame you." Jacob nodded. "I know," he replied. He paused for a moment, then continued, not to persuade but to speak the truth. "If I came down now, things would probably be easier for both of us. I wouldn't have to worry about what would have happened if... And you might blame yourself for not coming down." Abigail frowned slightly. "So why are you still here?" Jacob pondered. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wanted to choose the most honest one. "Because I don't want you to make a decision just because you're afraid of being left behind." Those words carried no intense emotion, no raised voice, no pleading. But they touched a place deep within Abigail, a place she had once thought no one cared about. She turned her head to look at him. Their eyes met for the first time. Jacob had no dashing appearance. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, his eyes weary of someone who had lived longer than dreams. But in that gaze there was no possessiveness, no impatience, only the steadfast presence of a man in no hurry to leave. Abigail realized, and that realization brought a lump to her throat. "Aren't you afraid I'll never come down?" she asked. Jacob's lips curled, slight, not a smile, but a subtle reflex of someone accustomed to facing the possibility of loss. "I'm afraid of many things," he replied. "But spending my whole life with someone who's only with me because they have no other choice, I'm more afraid of that." Abigail bowed her head. The tears had stopped falling. Instead, there was a strange feeling, like when someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long is suddenly allowed to set it down, even if only for a moment. The train whistle blew again, this time longer, deeper. The ticket inspector called out from the front. The decision could not be delayed any longer. Abigail stood up, not abrupt, not dramatic, just a very slow, very real movement, like when someone stands up after a long, tiring day. She took a step toward the walkway, then stopped. Jacob wasn't moving, neither moving forward nor backward. The distance between them remained the same, a distance large enough that the choice was still hers. "I'm still scared," Abigail said, her voice hoarse but firm. "I'm afraid I'll choose the wrong one." Jacob nodded. "Fear doesn't mean it's wrong," he said. "It just means it matters." Abigail took a deep breath. She thought about the years gone by, about the old house, about the irretrievable losses, about how her whole life might be defined by just one role if today she stepped down, not out of desire but out of fear. Then she thought of something very simple but very true. If she steps down today, it will be for the first time in her life, because she has been chosen. Abigail held out her hand. Her hand trembled slightly, but it didn't close. It didn't clench. It was simply Opina's, a gesture of questioning, not pleading. Jacob looked at the hand, and only then did he take a step forward, not to guide, but to accept a decision. His hand touched hers, not a squeeze, not a pull. Just a warm, genuine presence saying whether she stays or leaves, she remains a valuable person. Abigail took another step. The deck vibrated gently beneath her feet. She felt her own weight intensely, as if for the first time she were truly standing in her own life, not drifting along with it. When she reached the last step, she stopped. Not to hesitate, but to remember this moment. She didn't look back at the train carriage. She looked straight out at the platform where the wind blew strongly, where the future held no promise of ease. But she stood tall. Jacob stood beside her, close enough to know he was there, far enough that she couldn't lean on him. The train began to move. The sound of metal grinding on the tracks echoed, then faded into the distance. Abigail let go of his hand. It wasn't because of the separation. It was because she no longer needed to cling to him. "I didn't come down because I had nowhere else to go," she said very softly, as if talking to herself. "I came down because I wanted to know how I could live." Jacob didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded, a nod of respect. And at Dry Creek Station, amidst the wind and dust, a small decision accomplished the greatest thing a human being can do for themselves. Stand where you choose on your own 2 feet. Dry Creek Station returned to its normal rhythm of life within minutes. The train departed, its metal grinding against the tracks, and the passengers were unaware that in the final carriage, a life had taken a different turn. The wind grew stronger, whipping dust across the platform. The ticket inspector turned his back. A porter dragged a crate toward the warehouse. No one paid attention to Abigail Monroe, and that, strangely enough, made her breathe a sigh of relief. She stood on the platform, her feet firmly planted on the old wooden planks, feeling the cold seep through the soles of her shoes. This wasn't a romantic moment. There was no music, no applause, only a very real feeling she was here. Jacob Harlan stood a reasonable distance from her. He didn't ask, "What do we do now?" He didn't say, "I'll take care of you," nor did he make any promises. He just said one very simple sentence, "It's getting dark. There's a small inn in town. If you'd like to stay there, I can show you the way." Abigail nodded. She realized she liked the way he said "if you want," as if the choice truly belonged to her, not some ritual to be followed. They walked along the dirt road leading into the town of Dry Creek. Rows of low, old but sturdy wooden houses. Oil lamps cast light from a few windows. The smell of burning wood dust, the scent of a place that had never promised ease but was not deceitful. Abigail walked slowly. It's not because she's tired. It's because she's learning not to rush. Jacob walked in sync, without rushing, without quickening his pace. He was used to adjusting his speed to the herd of cattle, to the weather, to those who could or didn't want to walk faster. The inn was located at the end of the main street, a 2-story building painted light brown with a wooden sign askew due to the wind. Inside, the soft yellow light shone. The landlady, an elderly woman with keen eyes, looked at Abigail for a moment, then at Jacob. Jacob spoke first. "She needs a room, just for herself. No further explanation needed." The landlady nodded, asking no further questions. In this land, people learn not to be overly curious. Abigail received the room key and climbed the creaky wooden stairs. The room was small and simple, an iron bed, a wooden table, a basin of water, and a window overlooking a darkening street. Nothing felt familiar, but nothing seemed threatening either. She put the cloth bag down, sit on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in a long time, Abigail Monroe allowed herself to not have to make any further decisions. Outside, Jacob stood in the lobby for a little while longer. He paid for the room for one night, no more. Then, putting on his hat, he went outside. He didn't ask her how long she would be staying. He didn't say he would be back tomorrow morning. He didn't make her feel like she owed him anything. That's not coldness. That's the discipline of someone who understands boundaries. The next morning, Abigail woke up very early. The faint sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust particles suspended in the air. The town was still quiet. She washed her face with cold water, combed her hair, and put on the simplest dress she had in her bag. As she went downstairs, she saw Jacob sitting at a table near the window, a cup of black coffee in front of him. He looked up and nodded in greeting, not surprised, not expecting it. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Abigail nodded. "I can sleep." The answer is short but true. They ate breakfast in silence. Bread, eggs, weak coffee. No one tried to fill the silence with meaningless stories. This silence wasn't heavy. It was like a room with an open window, air circulated, not forced. After the meal, Jacob stood up. "I'll be back at the farm today," he said. "It's about a 2-hour ride from here." Abigail looked at him, slightly surprised. She was used to others making decisions for her to stay, to go with him, or to arrange her future. "You don't need me to go with you?" she asked. Jacob shook his head. "You don't have to decide anything today," he said. "You can stay in town for a few days. Look for work. Think about what you want to do. If you need me, you know where I am." He placed a small piece of paper on the table, the farm's address, written in rough but legible handwriting. "Not a promise," he added. "Just information." Then he put on his hat, nodded in greeting, and left. "Don't look back." Abigail held the piece of paper in her hand for a long time. She realized that what moved her wasn't his departure, but the way he left at the right time, without pressure, without forcing her to follow. The following days passed slowly. Abigail found a part-time job at a small tailor shop at the end of the street. The work was simple: mending clothes, hemming dresses, and arranging fabric. The shop owner didn't ask about her past. She only cared about how carefully she worked. In the evening, she returned to her lodging. She read the Bible. She wrote a few lines in her old notebook. She listened to the wind blowing through the cracks in the door. No one came to find her. No one urged her. No one asked, "When will you decide?" And it was in this lack of pressure that Abigail began to feel something new: inner stability. 3 days later, Jacob returned to town, not to find her but to buy some necessities. They met by chance in front of the grocery store. He nodded in greeting as if greeting an acquaintance. "Are you all right?" he asked. "It's fine," Abigail replied, and this time she smiled. They walked together for a short distance. They talked about the weather, about work, about little things. No one mentioned marriage. No one asked about the future. Before turning in another direction, Jacob paused. "I won't be back in town for a few days," he said. "If you need, the note is still there." Abigail nodded. "I know." He left. She stopped. And in that very ordinary moment, Abigail Monroe understood something fundamental, something she would never forget for the rest of her life. Love can only blossom when no one is held back by obligation. And respect doesn't need vows. It's shown through appropriate and timely actions. The early days at Dry Creek didn't promise anything great, but they laid the first stone, firm, straight, and honest, for a relationship, if it were to exist, that would be built not on fear, but on conscious choice. Dry Creek is entering a period of strong winds. In the morning, the wind blew along the main street, carrying fine dust and the smell of dry earth. In the afternoon, the wind changed direction, striking the wooden roofs and producing familiar whistling sounds. The townspeople didn't complain. They were used to living with the winds. They were used to living with uncertainty. Abigail Monroe began to get used to that rhythm of life. She woke up early every day, had a simple breakfast at her boarding house, and walked to the tailor shop. The work was steady, not exciting, but stable. The needle moved up and down, each stitch neat and precise. Each finished garment was a complete task. No need for praise, no need for recognition. It was this repetition that gave her a new feeling that she was standing on her own 2 feet. Jacob Harlan doesn't appear very often. Sometimes Abigail wouldn't see him in town for 3 days straight. Other times a week would go by, and then she'd find him standing outside the grocery store buying salt and iron nails. He'd nod in greeting and ask a short question. "Is work going well?" Abigail replied. "It's fine." No more, no less. They didn't make appointments. There were no fixed schedules, no obligations. But strangely, this irregular presence created a sense of trustworthiness, like something unassuming yet never disappearing. One afternoon, as Abigail left the tailor shop later than usual, the sky darkened rapidly. A fierce wind arose. She pulled her cloak tighter and quickened her pace. As she turned onto the street leading to the boarding house, she saw Jacob standing at the end of the street, holding his hat in one hand. "The weather's bad," he said, his voice calm. "I think you might need someone to accompany you for this part of the journey." Abigail was surprised. "Are you waiting for me?" Jacob shook his head. "I was on my way home," he replied. "I saw that the wind was strong, so I stopped." They walked side by side without touching. The wind was so strong that they had to raise their voices slightly to be heard. Abigail didn't ask how he knew her work schedule. Jacob didn't explain. They both understood there are things that, if said, would lose their meaning. Jacob stopped in front of the guest house. "Good night," he said. "The wind will be strong tomorrow." Then he turned away, leaving Abigail standing on the wooden steps, her chest warming in a strange way. Not because she felt protected, but because she felt cared for without any strings attached. Time passed like that. The little things add up. Once Jacob brought a shirt with a torn elbow to the tailor, saying, "If it's all right, could you help me out?" Another time Abigail left her scarf on a bench in the square, and the next day she found it neatly folded and placed next to the shop door. No notes, no message. No one said, "I did this for you." Abigail began to walk more slowly down the street. Her shoulders no longer tensed up at the sound of footsteps behind her. She no longer flinched when someone called her name. One evening, after closing the tailor shop, the owner said to Abigail, "You're doing a good job. If you want to stay longer, I can pay you extra." Abigail smiled and thanked him. She didn't reply immediately, but as she stepped outside, the wind blew more gently. And in her heart a very clear thought arose: staying was no longer something to be afraid of. At the same time, Jacob Harlan faced his own challenges. His farm wasn't large. This season a fence on the west side had collapsed due to the wind. A horse had injured its leg. He repaired each thing one by one without complaining. At night he sat alone at his wooden table, recording expenses and calculating food supplies for the winter. At times he thought of Abigail, not with the impatience of a possessive person, but with a very honest question: is she all right, and does my presence make her uncomfortable? Jacob didn't come to town just to see her. He came when he needed to, and if they did meet, it was as two adults with their own lives. One early morning, Abigail received a message from her landlady. "Someone left this for you." It was a small cloth bag. Inside were some dried apples and a hard loaf of bread. It had no name. But Abigail knew. She wasn't overly emotional, no tears. She simply placed the cloth bag on the table carefully, as if putting something in its proper place. One Sunday afternoon they happened to meet by the stream outside of town. The weather was mild. The water flowed slowly. Jacob was inspecting a small wooden bridge. Abigail stopped and watched. "This bridge needs repairs every year," Jacob said, as if continuing a conversation that had already begun. "Otherwise, the rising water in winter will wash it away." Abigail nodded. "Things used for crossing," she said, "always need to be more robust than people think." Jacob looked at her, a hint of surprise in his eyes, then nodded. They sat on a large rock, watching the water flow. Neither spoke of their relationship. Neither asked, "What are we?" But in that silence both felt one thing very clearly: trust is building slowly but steadily. Jacob broke the silence first. "If you ever decide to leave Dry Creek," he said, "I want you to know that you don't owe me an explanation." Abigail turned to look at him. "And what if I stay?" she asked. Jacob pondered. "Well, I want to know if that's because you want to," he replied. "Not because I've been here too long." That quote isn't romantic, but it's true, and because it's true, it touches deeply. Abigail looked at the water, then nodded. "I get it." That evening, Abigail wrote in her old notebook, "There are people who don't enter our lives with promises. They stand there long enough at the right time for us to decide for ourselves whether or not to approach them." She closed the notebook. Outside, the wind still blows. Dry Creek remains harsh. There are no guarantees for the future. But one thing has become clearer than ever. Relationships worth maintaining don't need to be forced. They need to be proven through time, consistency, and respect. And somewhere amidst those stormy days, Abigail Monroe began to understand that if anything were to blossom from this land, it wouldn't be an escape from fear, but a conscious choice to stay. Autumn arrives at Dry Creek without warning. One morning, Abigail opened the door of her inn and noticed the atmosphere had changed. The wind was still blowing, but it was no longer harsh. It carried the scent of dry grass and withered leaves, the scent of things closing off to make way for new ones. The town was quieter. People spoke less. They walked slower, as if everyone understood that before winter, one shouldn't waste energy on unnecessary things. At the tailor shop there was more work. People were mending coats, reinforcing cuffs, and replacing buttons. Abigail worked until her hands ached, but her heart was at peace. Some days passed so peacefully that one forgets that life always holds unexpected twists and turns. Until that afternoon. Abigail was arranging the fabric when the shop owner walked in, holding a piece of paper. "Someone's looking for you," she said. "They're waiting outside." Abigail stepped out. Jacob wasn't at the shop door. He was a stranger, dressed more neatly than was typical in Dry Creek. His coat was clean, his shoes polished, and his hat neatly tied back. He nodded politely. "Abigail Monroe?" he asked. "Yes. I'm from Laramie," he said. "I've been asked to pass on a message. Someone old to your family knows you're here." Abigail paused slightly. Connections to the past rarely bring good news. She had learned that. He said, the man continued, "If you want, he can arrange a more stable job for you in the city. Good pay, decent housing. No need to stay in a town like this." Abigail listened without interrupting. She sensed the curious glances of a few passers-by. In small places like Dry Creek, news spreads faster than the wind. He didn't ask for an immediate answer, the man added. He just asked me to pass on the message. Abigail nodded. Thank you, sir. The man left. The streets returned to normal. But in Abigail, an old door had just been opened, not noisily, but enough for the wind to blow in. That evening she didn't eat at the guest house. She walked out of town following the path that led to the stream. The sky was gray. The wind was cold. The water flowed steadily, as if indifferent to human choices. Jacob Harlan is there. He sat on a rock, adjusting the saddle strap. When he heard footsteps, he looked up. No surprise. No questioning. Abigail stopped a few steps away from him. Is something wrong? Jacob asked, his voice calm. Abigail took a deep breath. Someone came to see me today, she said. From Laramie. Jacob lowered the saddle strap. He didn't ask immediately. He waited. They said I could leave Dry Creek, Abigail continued. A better job, an easier life. Jacob nodded very slightly. What do you think? The question was simple, but it was precisely that simplicity devoid of any clear direction that made Abigail feel a lump in her throat. I don't know yet, she replied truthfully. But I think you should know. Jacob gazed at the water for a long time. Thank you for telling me, he said finally. Abigail looked at him a little worried. Don't you feel uncomfortable? Jacob shook his head. No, he replied. If I felt uncomfortable, it would probably be a sign I'd gone too far. That remark silenced Abigail. You don't owe me an explanation, Jacob continued. Neither do you owe Dry Creek anything. Abigail sat down on the rock opposite him. I know, she said, but if I leave without saying anything, I'll feel like I'm running away. Jacob turned to look at her. And if you stay only because you're afraid of disappointing me, he said, that's also a form of escaping. The two looked at each other. There was no tension. Just the necessary frankness. There's something, Jacob said, his voice slow. I need to say this not to keep you here, but to make things clear. Abigail nodded. If you stay, Jacob continued, I want to know if it's because this life suits you, not because I've been here long enough for you to feel uncomfortable leaving. Abigail bowed her head. I also have something to say, she replied. If I leave, I don't want to carry the feeling that I've sacrificed something good just because I'm afraid of taking responsibility for it. Jacob remained silent. Then he said very slowly, responsibility only has meaning when it is chosen. The wind blew harder. Dry leaves flew across the water's surface. Abigail sensed a subtle but palpable shift. They were no longer just two cautious people standing side by side. They were laying the groundwork for a deeper respect, where words were used at the right time and in the right place. Do you think, Abigail asked, that if I stay, things will gradually become complicated? Jacob pondered. Life is complicated, he replied. But complexity isn't a bad thing. The bad thing is when people pretend it doesn't exist. Abigail smiled very slightly. He always says things that are not easy to refute. Jacob shrugged. I'm just saying things I can live with. They sat there for a while longer. No discussion of the decision. No deadline set. Just letting the truth be spoken and letting it find its place. As dusk approached, Abigail stood up. I don't have the answer yet, she said. Jacob also stood up. I don't need to, he replied. Just don't force yourself. On their way back to town, they walked side by side for a while, then parted ways as usual. Neither of them looked back. That night, Abigail sat by the window of her apartment for a long time. She took the piece of paper from Laramie and placed it on the table. Then she placed next to it the piece of paper with Jacob's farm address. Two paths. Neither is wrong, neither is easy. She blew out the lamp. In the darkness, a thought emerged clearer than on previous nights. A worthwhile relationship doesn't require us to sacrifice our right to choose. It requires us to be honest enough to exercise that right. And whatever the final decision, Abigail Monroe knew one thing for sure: she will not leave in silence, and she will not stay out of fear either. The following days at Dry Creek passed quietly. There were no events, no message from Laramie, no decisive encounter. Just gentler mornings, afternoons, with long, slanted rays of sunlight on the streets, and quiet evenings when the oil lamps were lit earlier than usual. Abigail Monroe continued working at the sewing shop. She no longer counted the days, no longer wondered when she would have to make a decision. She let time do its work, a work that no amount of persuasion could replace. In the morning she greets the shopkeeper, arranges the fabric, and picks up her needle and thread. At noon she eats bread and dried apples on the back steps, watching the sunlight filter through the gaps in the wood. In the afternoon she mends coats for those preparing for the cold season. The faces became familiar. No one asked her where she was from. No one asked when she was leaving. They just said, "Thank you," and went back to their lives. It was in this lack of excessive attention that Abigail realized something very true: she didn't need to prove her existence here. One afternoon, as she was mending the hem of a boy's shirt, he looked up and asked, "Will you be staying here for a long time?" The question was naive, lacking any expectation. Abigail paused for a moment, then replied, "Maybe." The boy nodded, satisfied with that uncertain answer. Abigail smiled. She realized she was happy too. Jacob Harlan still makes inconsistent appearances. Some days he would come to town just to buy seeds and iron nails. Other days he wouldn't show up for a whole week. When they met, they would greet each other, exchange a few words about the weather, about work, about things that didn't need to be explored in depth. No one mentioned Laramie again. It's not that they're avoiding it. It's because there's nothing that needs to be forced. One early morning Abigail was sweeping the porch of her inn when she saw Jacob leading his horse past. He stopped and looked up at the pale gray sky. "It's going to get frosty," he said. "It's going to be cold tonight." Abigail nodded. "Thank you, sir." Jacob looked at her for a second longer than usual. "If you need more firewood," he said, "the landlady might not have enough." Abigail smiled. "I'll ask." He nodded and continued walking. No bags of firewood were brought. No forced help, just a timely reminder, enough for her to manage on her own. That evening, Abigail asked for more firewood and built a fire herself. The small fire burned steadily, radiating warmth. She sat near the fire, read a few pages of a book, and then wrote in her old notebook. The feeling of security doesn't come from having someone by your side all the time. It comes from knowing that, if necessary, you can stand on your own 2 feet. She closed the notebook. Outside, the wind was blowing gently, no longer fierce. One Sunday, Abigail decided to walk out of town to where the trail led up the low hillside. From there she could see Dry Creek in its entirety, the wooden roofs, the wisps of smoke, the winding stream in the distance. "Jacob is there." He leaned against the old fence, looking down into the valley. When he heard footsteps, he turned around. "You're here too," Abigail nodded. "I want to see everything from a distance." They stood next to each other without touching. The wind on the hill was cooler. "From here," Abigail said, "Dry Creek looks small." Jacob smiled very slightly. "Small, but enough." That answer made Abigail think. "Have you ever thought," she asked, "that you've stayed in one place too long?" Jacob looked down at the town. "Yes," he replied, "many times." Abigail turned to him. "So why is he still here?" Jacob thought for a moment. "Because every time I think about leaving," he said, "I don't see anywhere else where I could live more fully. Not easier, just more right." Abigail remained silent. These words are not an invitation. They are not advice. They are simply a personal truth, spoken without being imposed. "And you," Jacob asked, "what do you think of this place, when you look at it from afar?" Abigail took a deep breath. "I think," she said slowly, "that if I leave, I'll be taking a part of Dry Creek with me. But if I stay, I don't feel like I'm giving up anything." Jacob nodded. "That's a significant difference." They stood there for a while longer, letting the wind do the rest. In the following days, Abigail began doing small, long-term things. She asked the shop owner for more work. She bought a more durable pair of shoes, instead of mending the old ones. She asked the landlady about renting a room by the month instead of by the day. No one asked her to do it. No one took it seriously. But for Abigail, these were signs of a choice being lived, not just thought about. One evening, Jacob stopped by the boarding house to return a book she had lent him from the small-town library. He placed the book on the table and stood there for a moment. "I heard you took on extra work," he said. Abigail nodded. It seems she intends to stay, he continued, his voice neutral. Abigail looked at him. I'm trying to live as if I'm staying, she replied, to see if that feeling is real. Jacob didn't smile. He just nodded a nod of respect. What did that feel like, he asked. Abigail thought for a moment. Not light, she said, but sturdy. Jacob took a deep breath. That's enough to get started. They said nothing more. That night, Abigail sat alone in her room, gazing at the small fire. She thought of Laramie Place, that could offer her more faster. And then she thought of Dry Creek, a place that offered no promises but didn't demand that she become someone else. She understood that her decision wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a series of days where each morning she woke up without feeling pulled away or held back. And she understood one more thing. Something only those who have experienced fear can understand. Staying when we have every right to leave is a choice that requires just as much courage as leaving. Abigail Monroe blew out the lamp. Outside, Dry Creek was silent. It wasn't waiting for her. It wasn't holding her back. And that's why for the first time she felt she truly belonged here, not because she was bound to it but because she had freely chosen it. That morning arrived quite ordinarily. There was no warning that it would be any different from the previous days. A gentle breeze. The sky was high and clear. Dry Creek awoke to familiar sounds. The early opening of the bakery. The clatter of horses' hooves on the dirt road, the sweeping of brooms on the inn's porch. Abigail Monroe woke up before dawn. She didn't get up because she was restless or anxious. She got up because of a very clear feeling it was time to speak out. Not to reassure anyone, not to hold anyone back, but to put things in their proper place. She washed her face, brushed her hair, and put on her familiar blue dress. Before leaving the room, she looked around the iron bed, the wooden table, the window overlooking the small street. Those simple things were no longer just temporary shelters. They had become her living space. At the sewing shop, Abigail worked as usual. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't trying to finish early. Each stitch was even and straight. When the noon bell rang, she carefully folded up her work. "I'd like to leave work early this afternoon," she told the shop owner. The landlady nodded. "You've done enough. No further explanation is needed." Abigail stepped out into the street, the midday sun slanting across the wooden rooftops. She didn't go straight back to the inn. She turned toward the stream, the place where she and Jacob had said important things, and where no one could eavesdrop. Jacob Harlan arrived there a little later than her. He led his horse over, tied the rope to a wooden stake, and then walked over. Seeing Abigail, he nodded as if this meeting had been arranged beforehand, even though there had been no prior arrangement. "Are you looking for me?" he asked. Abigail nodded. "Yes." Jacob didn't ask any further questions. He sat down on his usual rock, leaving enough space for her to choose her spot. Abigail sat opposite him. She was silent for a moment. Not because she hadn't prepared her words, but because she wanted to make sure that what she said came from a calm demeanor, not from a momentary emotion. "I've been thinking a lot," Abigail began. "Not just about Dry Creek, but about how I want to live." Jacob listened, his eyes calm. "I could leave," she continued. "Laramie is still an option. Maybe easier, maybe faster." Jacob nodded. He didn't deny it. "But every morning when I wake up here," Abigail said, her voice, "even I don't feel like I'm being held back, nor do I feel like I'm running away from anything." She looked up at him. "So I decided to stay in Dry Creek." Jacob didn't say anything right away. He lowered his head, gazing at the water, letting the words find their place. After a while, he looked up. She said, "Stay," he asked, "in what capacity?" The question wasn't sharp, not probing, just the necessary caution of someone who doesn't want to be misunderstood. Abigail took a deep breath. "As a woman who supports herself," she replied. "One who chose this place because it fits her rhythm of life. Not as anyone's wife. Not because of a promise." Jacob nodded very slowly. "Thank you for explaining," he said. Abigail looked at him, waiting not for an emotional response but for confirmation that her words had been respected. "And there's one more thing," she said. "I don't want my staying to be interpreted as an implicit commitment." Jacob looked straight at her. "You don't need to worry about that," he said. "I don't consider your choice a promise. A sense of relief spread through Abigail, not outwardly, but deeply. "I don't want to start anything," she continued, "from a feeling of obligation or gratitude." Jacob smiled very slightly, the smile of someone who understands. "Then we're in the right place," he said. "If anything is going to start, it will start with mutual consent." Abigail nodded. "That's what I've been hoping for." They sat still for a moment. The wind blew across the water, carrying the scent of dry grass. There was no tension, no awkward silence, only clarity, something they both cherished. Jacob spoke first. "I also need to say something," he said, "not in response to your decision, but to keep things straight." Abigail looked at him. "If you stay in Dry Creek," Jacob said slowly, "I won't take it a chance. I won't get any closer unless you want me to. And if one day you change your mind, I will respect that as I do today." Abigail listened to every word. "Aren't you afraid?" she asked. "I'm scared," Jacob replied. "But what I fear most is inadvertently depriving others of their right to choose." She smiled. It wasn't a radiant smile, but a steady one. "Then we understand each other," she said. Jacob rose first, as usual, not to end the conversation but to avoid prolonging it unnecessarily. He tightened the reins, preparing to leave. He paused before turning his back. "I'm glad you stayed," he said, "not because I wanted you to, but because you chose to." Abigail stood up and watched him go. "Thank you," she replied, "for waiting, in the right way." Jacob nodded, then led the horse away. That afternoon Abigail returned to her boarding house. She set down her sewing bag, changed her dress, and sat by the window. The sunlight slanted, illuminating the wooden floor. The town unfolded before her eyes, like a picture needing no editing. She felt neither excitement nor fear, only a very mature sense of peace. The decision has been made. No further confirmation is needed. That evening the landlady asked, "Are you planning to stay long?" Abigail smiled. "Yes, just one word." But it was a word spoken after many days of consideration. That night Abigail wrote in her old notebook, "Staying is not the end of freedom. Staying when I can leave is how I use my freedom." She closed the notebook and blew out the lamp. Out there, Dry Creek was silent. No train whistles, no urging, just a small town and a woman who had laid her choice firmly on the ground, steadfast, without regret. After Abigail announced her decision to stay in Dry Creek, nothing noticeably changed. No private meeting was arranged. No questioning glances. No words hinting at the opening of a new door. The town woke up each morning as usual, and both Abigail and Jacob went on with their lives as if what had just been said was merely a small piece of the puzzle, needing time to fit into the whole. But it is in that very immutability that something else begins to take shape. Abigail took on extra work at the tailor's shop. Not because she urgently needed money, but because she realized winter would arrive sooner than expected. Thick coats, gloves, scarves all needed repairing. She worked more carefully, not just for the pay, but because she understood that the things she made would be used during the harshest days. Jacob at the farm was also preparing for the cold season. He repaired the barn roof, reinforced the doors, and stockpiled hay. The work was harder than usual. Some nights he came home late, covered in dust and smelling of sweat. But he never delayed any because he was used to not putting off today's work until tomorrow. They don't see each other very often. But when we met, one very small thing was different. One afternoon, Jacob stopped by the tailor's shop carrying a thick canvas sheet torn at the corner. "If it can be fixed," he said, "I'll use it to cover the hay shed." Abigail took the tarp and examined the tear. "I will," she replied, "but it will take a few days." Jacob nodded. No rush. The way he said no rush wasn't just politeness. It was a matter of belief. 3 days later, when Jacob returned, the canvas had been sewn back together securely, the stitches coarse but even. He picked it up, pulled it a corner to test it, and nodded. "You did a good job," he said. This wasn't just polite praise, it was a meaningful comment. Abigail smiled. She didn't say thank you. She just nodded as if they had just completed a task together, needing no further confirmation. These small things happen repeatedly. Jacob brought in an old, worn-out worker's coat that needed mending at the cuffs. Abigail repaired it, and then asked the shopkeeper to leave it after closing time. Jacob came to pick it up, paying the exact amount, no more, no less. On another occasion, Abigail needed to transport some heavy rolls of cloth from a warehouse outside town. Jacob happened to be there. He helped load them onto the cart without saying much. When they arrived, he set them down, nodded, and left. No one called it helping. No one considered it an obligation. It's about sharing responsibility when necessary, not turning it into a favor. Abigail began to realize, when Jacob showed up, she didn't need to prepare herself. She didn't need to adjust her words. She didn't need to worry about expectations. He arrived as part of the scene, not taking up space, not disrupting the rhythm. And Jacob realized the same thing about Abigail. She didn't ask him if he was tired that day. She didn't inquire about the farm work. But when he mentioned the west barn roof wasn't finished repairing, she simply nodded and a few days later gave him a bag of hard bread and dried meat. "For convenience," she said, "nothing more." Jacob accepted it. He didn't refuse. He didn't thank me excessively. He understood that this wasn't about care but about preparation. One windy evening, Abigail was closing her shop when she saw Jacob standing at the end of the street. His coat was covered in dust, his hood pulled low. He stopped when he saw her. "My horse has sprained its hoof," he said. "I'll walk home." Abigail watched the sky darken. "Would you like to stay at the inn?" she asked, her voice calm. Jacob thought for a moment. "If there are rooms available," he replied. "There's no awkwardness, no speculation, just a logical choice given the circumstances." That evening Jacob rented a private room. They had dinner at a long table in the lobby along with a few other people. They didn't sit next to each other. They didn't whisper. There was no difference from the people around them. But as the oil lamp was about to go out, Abigail brought Jacob a basin of hot water, placed it outside his room. "To wash my hands," she said. Jacob nodded. "Thank you." No one entered anyone's room. No one lingered. The night passed peacefully. The next morning, Jacob left early. On the table he left his own rent money, not with Abigail's help. Next to it was a small note. "The storage tarp is usable. That's all." Abigail took the piece of paper, folded it, and put it in her pocket. She realized she wasn't nervous at all reading it. No anticipation, no decoding, just complete information. Time passed and people in the town began to take notice. It's not because they act overly friendly. It's because they always show up when needed and disappear when not needed. A carpenter said to Abigail, "She and Jacob work well together." Abigail smiled. "We're just doing our job." That answer is true. Jacob heard similar whispers. He didn't deny them, but he didn't encourage them either. He understood that in small places like Dry Creek, the danger wasn't the rumor itself, but letting the rumor lead the way. One Sunday afternoon, they all joined in repairing the small wooden bridge outside of town. Not just the two of them, but the whole group. Jacob carried the wood. Abigail brought the water. Everyone worked quietly. When the work was finished, they stood and watched the water flowing below. "This bridge will be in use for a few more years," Jacob said. Abigail nodded. "If they're willing to fix it." Jacob looked at her. Things that are repaired promptly tend to last longer. Abigail understood what he was talking about, not just the bridge. That evening, Abigail sat down and wrote in her usual notebook, "Some relationships don't begin with emotions, but with responsibility. Not a binding responsibility, but a responsibility that emerges when needed and retreats when no longer necessary." She closed the notebook. Outside, Dry Creek was silent. Winter was approaching. No one spoke of the future. No one named what was taking shape. But both Abigail Monroe and Jacob Harlan sensed one thing very clearly. When two people can share responsibilities without encroaching on each other's choices, that's already a solid foundation, even if it doesn't need to be explicitly named. Winter arrived earlier than expected. One morning, Dry Creek awoke to a thick fog and a biting cold. The night before, a light but steady snowfall had blanketed the wooden roofs in a thin layer of white, enough to signal the end of the easy days. The townspeople didn't panic. They simply slowed things down, becoming more cautious, like people accustomed to living with reality without needing to show off their anxiety. Abigail Monroe wrapped a scarf tightly around her neck and left the boarding house very early. The dirt road was hard with cold. Each step made a faint creaking sound. The tailor's shop was open later than usual, as many people didn't go out in this kind of weather. But not all of them. When Abigail arrived, the shop owner was already waiting. "The wooden bridge to the north is damaged," she said immediately. "The water is rising. If it's not repaired soon, people on the other side won't be able to cross." Abigail stopped what she was doing. The bridge wasn't big, but it was the only way for a few families to get food into town. If it were washed away, they would be isolated for the entire winter. "Does Jacob know yet?" Abigail asked. "Certainly," the landlady replied. "He's gathering people." Abigail didn't think twice. She took off her scarf and hung it on the hook. "I'll bring water and bandages," she said. "You might need them." No one asked her to do it, but she had learned that in moments like these, standing still was an option, but not an option she wanted. The northern bank of the stream was more crowded than usual. Jacob Harlan stood among the men, his thick coat and hat pulled low. He was assigning tasks, not raising his voice, not giving orders, just speaking concisely and clearly. When he saw Abigail approach, he nodded, neither surprised nor stopping her. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. Abigail nodded. "I can help." Jacob looked at her for a second longer, then turned to the person next to him. "Keep her near the shore," he said. "Don't let her go into the water." That wasn't an order. It was a proper expression of concern without infringing upon her right to make her own decisions. "Work begins immediately." The snow was falling thicker. The water was freezing cold. Old wooden planks were pulled up and replaced with new ones. Ropes were tied tightly. Every movement was more difficult because of the cold and wind. At one point, someone slipped and fell into the muddy bank. Abigail immediately came forward, offering bandages and water. "Sit still," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. Jacob stood a few steps away, observing. He didn't interfere. He knew she was doing her job correctly. Time dragged on in the cold. Hands were numb. Breath turned white. No one talked about when it would be finished. They just worked little by little. When the sun was high in the sky, the makeshift bridge was reinforced enough to allow passage. Not perfect, but enough to survive the winter. Everyone stood silently for a moment, watching the water flowing below. "That's enough," Jacob said. "That's enough for today." No one objected. Everyone understood the limits of their own bodies. On the way back to town, the snow started falling more heavily. Abigail walked slowly. Her gloves were wet. Her fingers were numb with cold. Jacob walked beside her, keeping a safe distance, enough so that if she slipped, he could catch her, but not so close that she would lose her balance. At the bend near the guest house, Abigail stopped. "Thank you," she said. Jacob shook his head. "No need." She looked at him, understanding that he wasn't rejecting gratitude, just didn't want to turn standing together into something to be indebted to. "I just wanted to say," Abigail continued today, "I don't feel like I'm being dragged into this. I chose to come." Jacob nodded. "And I'm glad you chose," he said. "Not because the work is easier, but because you didn't turn your back on me." They stood still for a moment, the snow falling silently around them. "Have you ever thought," Abigail asked, "that there might come a day when you're no longer strong enough to do things like this?" Jacob pondered. "Yes," he replied. "That's why I always try to do what needs to be done while I still can." That statement isn't pessimistic. It's realistic, the kind of realism of people who don't live in illusions. That evening, the town's electricity went out early. Everyone stayed indoors. The wind howled outside and snow pounded against the windows. Abigail sat by the fireplace in the inn, wrapped in a blanket. The landlady placed a bowl of hot soup in front of her. "You did well today," she said. Abigail smiled. "Everyone does." Elsewhere in town, Jacob sat in his small log cabin. He hung up his wet coat, changed his clothes, and then sat down at the table. On the table were a pair of old gloves sewn, torn at the thumb. He looked at them for a moment, then folded them. Tomorrow he will take it to the tailor. It's not because it needs urgent repair. Rather, things that continue to happen need a natural reason. In the days that followed, the town spoke of the Bridgeneau as a triumph, but as a task that needed to be done. No one praised anyone. No one took credit. But a new, unspoken understanding developed between Abigail and Jacob. They stood on the same side when things got tough. Not because of a promise, not because of feelings that could be named, but because they both chose not to leave. One afternoon, when Abigail returned the securely mended gloves, Jacob picked them up and nodded. "She mends very carefully," he said. "Things used in winter need to be sturdy," she replied. Jacob looked at her, his gaze becoming more somber. "Those who go through the winter together," he said slowly, "need that too." Abigail didn't answer immediately. She just nodded. And in that nod, there was no promise. But there was a willingness. That night, Abigail wrote in her usual notebook, "Some relationships are not tested by words, but by the winter. When things get tough, who stays and who turns away will answer all the questions themselves." She blew out the lamp. Outside, the snow continues to fall. Dry Creek is shrouded in silence. But beneath that cold, a deeper foundation has been laid, not by emotion, but by the choice to stand on the same side when it's not easy. Winter in Dry Creek doesn't come with a harsh intensity. It came slowly, persistently, day by day. The snow didn't fall heavily at first, but the cold seeped in. The cold wasn't just on the rooftops or the pavement, it seeped into the wood, the earth, even into people's habits. The townspeople learned to speak less, walk less, and think more carefully before making any decision. Abigail Monroe clearly sensed that change. She no longer left the boarding house as early as before. In the mornings, she waited until the sun had risen high enough to dispel the frost before going out. At the tailor shop, the work was more strenuous. Thick coats, stiff fabrics, and strong stitches. Each stitch slowed down, not from fatigue, but because there was no room for error. That evening, Abigail returned to her room early. She lit a fire, read, and jotted down a few notes in her notebook. Not to record anything significant, just small observations. The snow was soft today. The street was deserted today. She didn't feel afraid today. Jacob Harlan also lives life at a slower pace. There wasn't much outdoor work on the farm in winter, but that didn't mean he was idle. He checked the hay storage every day, repaired the windows that had been blown open by the wind, and took extra care of the horses. On long nights, he sat at his desk, adjusting tools, taking notes, letting time pass in silence. They don't see each other very often, but their absence didn't create an uncomfortable void. It was like the pause between two breaths, natural, necessary. One snowy afternoon, Abigail didn't go to the tailor's shop. The owner closed it early. She stayed in her room reading until the light faded. When she got up to add more firewood, she realized the woodshed was almost empty. She put on her coat, stepped out onto the porch, and looked over at the shared storage room behind the boarding house. The storage room door was jammed shut with ice. She was fumbling around when she heard footsteps. Jacob stood a few steps away, his coat covered in snow. "I'm bringing more firewood," he said, as if it were a predetermined decision. Abigail paused for a moment. You're passing through here," Jacob nodded. "I went into town to get some salt. It's getting colder." No one asked any further questions. Jacob put the bundle of firewood down, helped open the shed door, and neatly stacked the wood. He worked quickly and efficiently without staying long. "Thank you," Abigail said. Jacob looked at her. "Stay warm," just 2 words. But that's enough. He left, leaving Abigail standing on the porch, feeling one thing very clearly: concern needs no promise to carry weight. In the following days, it snowed continuously. Dry Creek seemed to shrink back. People rarely ventured outside after dark. Restaurants closed early. Church was only open on Sunday mornings. The small town was like one large room where everyone knew to keep quiet for one another. One evening, Abigail heard a knock at the door. No rushing, no hurrying. When she opened the door, she saw Jacob standing outside holding an oil lamp. "My lamp is broken," he said. "I borrowed this from the guest house, but they said, if you don't mind." Abigail looked at the lamp, then at the snow falling. "Come in," she said. "It's cold." Jacob entered, standing near the door, not venturing any further than necessary. Abigail placed the lamp on the table and lit it. They sat opposite each other across the table. There was no awkwardness, no embarrassment. "Is the farm all right?" Abigail asked. "It's fine," Jacob replied. "Just get through this season." Abigail nodded. "That's how everything is." They were silent. Outside, the wind howled. The flickering firelight reflected on the wooden wall. "I didn't come to bother you," Jacob said after a moment. "It's just, I didn't want to walk in the dark, without a light." Abigail understood. And she understood something else. He had chosen to come here, because this was where he felt safe knocking on doors. "You can sit here a little longer," she said. "Wait until the snow stops." Jacob nodded. They sat there drinking hot tea. No loud talking, just scattered conversations about the weather, the old horse, a window that needed fixing. When the snow stopped, Jacob stood up. "Thank you," he said. "I'll return the lamp." Abigail smiled. "No need to rush." He put on his hat, opened the door, then stopped. "Abigail," he said, calling her by her name for the rare occasion. She looked up. "Thank you for being here," he said. "Nothing more." She nodded. "I'm here because I chose to." Jacob nodded in response, a nod of understanding. Winter is long. There were weeks they didn't see each other. There were days they just passed each other on the street, exchanging a nod. But each time they met again, there was no feeling of distance, no need to catch up. One Sunday, the snow stopped falling. The sky was clear and cold. The townspeople gathered at the small church. Abigail sat in the middle pew. Jacob sat a few rows behind her. The lecture was about patience. No one looked at each other. But when they stood up to leave, they walked to the door together. "Today's lecture is timely," Abigail said. Jacob nodded. "Patience is not waiting in vain." Abigail smiled. "But it means staying until we see the results." Jacob looked at her. "And don't leave just because it's difficult." They stopped on the church steps. The snow crunched softly under their feet. "Are you tired?" Abigail asked. Jacob thought for a moment. "Yes, but it's an acceptable level of fatigue." Abigail understood. It was the weariness of someone who knew why they were suffering. That night, Abigail wrote, "Winter doesn't teach people to fall in love faster. It teaches them to stay long enough to understand who won't leave when everything is quiet and cold." She closed the notebook and blew out the lamp. Out there, Dry Creek sleeps peacefully beneath the snow. There's no promise of an early spring, but what survives winter is rarely lost. Winter doesn't retreat as quickly as one might expect. The snow stops falling, then falls again. Some mornings the sky is so blue it seems spring has arrived, but as evening falls, the cold returns, reminding us that things are not yet over. Dry Creek lives in that middle ground, no longer harsh but not easy either. Abigail Monroe began to notice a very small change within herself. She no longer counted the days of winter, no longer looked out the window wondering when it would all be over. Instead, she focused on the tasks at hand, mending clothes, boiling water, writing a few lines in her notebook. Each task completed made each day a full day. One morning, the owner of the tailor shop said to Abigail, "The bridge on the north side needs inspection again. The ice has melted and the water is flowing rapidly." Abigail nodded. She didn't ask who would be going. She knew. Jacob Harlan was standing by the stream when she arrived. He was bending down to check the joints of the planks, his familiar old gloves carefully mended. "You've arrived," he said, as if acknowledging her presence, not expressing surprise. Abigail nodded. "I brought hot water." She set the water bottle down and stood watching the strong current flowing beneath the bridge. The melting ice formed slow-moving chunks that collided with each other, producing a dry, heavy sound. "The bridge is holding up," Jacob said. "But we need to replace a plank." Abigail rolled up her sleeves. "I'll hold the ladder." Jacob worked. She held the ladder. No one said anything more. The wind blew, the water flowed, the wood creaked. The work proceeded as a long-established routine, even though they had never actually done this together many times before. When they finished their work, they stood aside and looked back. "Okay," Jacob said. Abigail nodded. "Okay." Two identical statements made at the same time caused both of them to pause for a very brief moment. No one laughed. No one commented. But something very fitting had just happened. On the way back to town, they walked side by side. There was no need to maintain the distance they had before. Not because anything had changed suddenly, but because that distance had adjusted itself over time. Abigail stopped in front of the bakery. "I bought some cakes," she said. "Would you like some?" Jacob nodded. "If it's convenient." He said it the same way, if it was convenient. But the way Abigail heard it was different now. They sat on the steps in front of the shop, eating warm pastries. No one was in a hurry. The sun was high in the sky, casting a soft, gentle light. "Do you remember," Abigail said, "the first time we spoke?" Jacob thought for a moment. "On the ship." Abigail nodded. "Back then, I didn't think I'd be sitting here." Jacob gazed into the distance. "I didn't think I'd get on the ship either." They both fell silent, not to reminisce, but to acknowledge the path they had traveled. "Have you ever," Abigail asked, "regretted waiting?" Jacob answered very quickly. "No." Then after a moment's pause he added, "Not because of the result, but because I did something I can live with." Abigail smiled. "I understand." She understands very well. That afternoon Abigail visited a family on the outskirts of town to mend a child's dress. When she finished, the mother gave her a bag of potatoes. "Take this," she said. "Everyone needs it this season." Abigail accepted, thanking him. On the way home, snow began to fall lightly. She walked slowly, the bag of potatoes heavy. At the bend in the road, Jacob appeared as if he always appeared where he was most needed, but never sooner. "I'll help," he said. Abigail handed him the bag, and he didn't refuse. They walked together. When they arrived at the inn, Jacob put the bag down. "You keep it," he said. "I already have one." Abigail nodded. "Then I'll make soup sometime." Jacob looked at her. "Which day?" Abigail thought for a moment. Then she said quite naturally, "Sunday." There were no formal invitations. There was no hesitation. Jacob nodded. "I'll come. Sunday is coming." It wasn't a special day. It was pleasantly cold. No snow was falling. The inn was quiet. Abigail was cooking a large pot of soup, its aroma wafting through the hallway. The landlady smiled as she passed by. "Do you have a visitor?" she asked. Abigail nodded. "Yes." Jacob arrived on time. He brought a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk. They ate together at a small table in the communal kitchen. Not formal, not awkward. The conversation revolved around very ordinary things. Spring would be late. The bridge needed further inspection. The horses were feeling better. During the meal, there was a very long moment of silence. No one tried to break it. And in that silence, Abigail suddenly realized something that surprised her. She no longer paid attention to how she was sitting, what she was saying, or what she needed to be mindful of. She was simply there. Jacob realized the same thing. He didn't need to appear more composed than necessary. He didn't need to weigh every word. Abigail's presence didn't demand any proof from him. After the meal, Jacob stood up. "Thank you," he said. "The soup was delicious." Abigail smiled. "Just come whenever you need to." Jacob stopped and looked at her. "Not just when necessary," he said very softly. "When it's convenient." Abigail nodded. "When it's convenient." Those two words carry an entire world of unspoken understanding. That evening, Abigail sat alone by the window, the oil lamp casting a golden light on the page. She wrote, "There are bonds that are not forged by a single moment, but by many small moments, ordinary enough to go unnoticed, yet real enough to be undeniable." She closed the notebook. Out there, Dry Creek was quiet. No vows, no major turning points. But one thing was clear, like the ground after the ice melts. They've been in each other's lives for some time now, and no one needs to ask when it started. Spring in Dry Creek doesn't arrive with shouts of joy. It arrived with very subtle signs. The ice melted more slowly than expected. The ground softened underfoot. The wind carried the damp scent of freshly exposed earth. The townspeople didn't talk much about spring. They simply started working earlier, repairing what winter had loosened, and making calculations for an uncertain year ahead. Abigail Monroe recognized spring through her work schedule. Fewer thick coats were brought in. Instead, there were light dresses needing hems altered and shirts needing buttons replaced. The light in the tailor's shop lasted until late afternoon. She opened the windows more often, letting the breeze carry the scent of the earth into the room. She also noticed another change, a very subtle one. In the evening, she no longer felt the need to end the day early. She lingered at her desk reading a few more pages or sewing a few more stitches. Time was no longer something to avoid. Jacob Harlan at the farm begins work for the new season. He repaired the fence, prepared the soil, and checked the water source. Spring was a time for many practical decisions: what plants to grow, how much hay to keep, what work to hire. One afternoon, Jacob arrived in town earlier than usual. He stopped by the tailor's shop carrying a neatly folded stack of papers. "Are you free?" he asked. Abigail glanced at the wall clock. 1 hour left. Jacob nodded. "I'll wait." He sat in a chair near the window, not interrupting her work. Abigail continued sewing but noticed her hand movements slowed, not from distraction, but because she knew this conversation required concentration. When the shop closed, Abigail hung up the wooden sign and turned back. "What do you want to talk about?" she asked. Jacob placed the stack of papers on the table and opened them. They contained very simple notes, a list of tasks, expenses, and timelines. "I'm planning to hire more people for this season," he said. "The farm needs more workers, but I don't want to hire just anyone." Abigail nodded. "He needs someone who works consistently. And we need people to stay," Jacob continued. "Not just for one season." Abigail looked at the papers. "She didn't ask if it concerned me." She waited. "I think," Jacob said slowly, "that if I keep going back and forth between the farm and town, there will be things I don't have time for." Abigail looked up. "Are you thinking about moving?" she asked. Jacob nodded. "Not exactly, but I was thinking about reducing the distance." He paused, then explained further. "The farm has a small house near the south shed. It used to be used by the farmhands. If renovated, it would be enough for long-term living." Abigail listened. She didn't react immediately. "I'm not saying this as an invitation," Jacob continued. "I'm saying it as a practical option. If you want, you can move there as a tenant with a clear contract, close to the farm, close to work, and still have your own space." Abigail was silent for a long time. It wasn't because it was surprising. It was because the way he spoke put everything in the right place. "Have you thought this through?" she asked. Jacob nodded. "I don't want anything to be ambiguous. If you don't think it's appropriate, we can skip it." Abigail picked up a piece of paper and read it carefully. "Rent, repair responsibilities, term, clear and concise, no hidden clauses, no promises attached." "Aren't you afraid," she asked, "that people will misunderstand?" Jacob looked at her. "I'm more afraid of letting misunderstandings decide our fate." That statement wasn't harsh. It was factual and therefore persuasive. Abigail put the paper down. "I need to think," she said. Jacob nodded. "Think about it. No need to answer right away." In the days that followed, Abigail acted on her thoughts. She walked to the edge of town, looking toward the farm. The distance wasn't far, but far enough so they wouldn't overlap. She asked the landlady about moving out, not immediately, just asking. The landlady nodded, showing no surprise. "You're grown up now," she said. "You know what you need." Abigail also spoke with the owner of the tailor shop. "If I move closer to the farm," she said, "I would still want to work here. At least a few days a week." The landlady nodded. "You did a good job. I don't want to lose you." That answer made Abigail feel relieved. She didn't have to trade her job for closeness. One afternoon, Abigail came to see the little house. It's not pretty. Old wooden walls, windows need fixing. But the afternoon light is very soft. There's a wooden table, a small stovetop, and a yard big enough to grow vegetables. Jacob stood a few steps away from her, letting her see for herself. "If you're not comfortable with that," he said, "we can't discuss it any further." Abigail touched the windowsill. "Rough wood. Really? I don't need convenience," she said. "I need clarity." Jacob nodded. "Me too." A week later, Abigail made her decision. They sat on the steps in front of the small house, the afternoon sun stretching across them. "I'll move in," Abigail said. "On the terms you said." "The tenant, obviously." Jacob didn't smile broadly. He just nodded, a nod of someone who knew their responsibility had just increased. "We'll sign the papers," he said. "And if you want any changes, I'll deduct them from the rent." Abigail nodded. "I'll fix the inside myself." They looked at each other. No emotion surged, but there was a sense of trust laid bare, frankly. Moving day went smoothly. Abigail brought the essentials: clothes, books, a notebook, and a sewing kit. Jacob wouldn't carry anything unless she asked him to. He stood there waiting. Once everything was in place, Abigail closed the door and stood in her new home. She didn't see herself moving in with someone. She saw herself moving to a different phase of life. That evening, Jacob brought a bundle of firewood. "Get it ready," he said. "It's still cold tonight." Abigail received it and placed it next to the kitchen. "Thank you," she said. Then she added, "I'll come to the shop tomorrow." Jacob nodded. "I'll stay at the farm." They stood there for a while, then each went back to their own business. On her first night in the new house, Abigail slept very soundly. No dreams, no sleepless nights. The next morning she woke up, lit a fire, and opened the window. The wind carried the scent of fresh earth, the sound of horses in the distance, the first birds of the season. She realized one thing very clearly: this decision didn't shrink her. It expanded her life in a sustainable way. And, at that right distance between two adults, a new form of connection began, built on agreement, respect, and the daily routines they needed to follow. The first few weeks in the small house passed without a fuss. Abigail Monroe maintained her routine. She would wake up early, light a fire, eat a simple meal, and walk into town on days when she had work at the tailor's shop. On other days she stayed home to tidy up, replacing door hinges, mending curtains, repairing the low wooden bookshelf. Everything was done slowly, carefully, at the pace she had become accustomed to during the winter. Jacob Harlan doesn't come very often. He would drop by when he needed to discuss something: repairing the drainage ditch, scheduling the workers, or simply asking if anything was missing from the house. He wouldn't go inside unless invited. When necessary, he would stand on the porch, hat in hand, speaking just loud enough. That freedom isn't a cold distance, it's space to breathe. But living in a shared environment inevitably requires adjustments. One afternoon, Abigail was hanging out the cloth to dry in the yard when Jacob arrived, bringing 2 new servants with him. He pointed toward the south shed. "This house," he told them, "is not a workplace. Leave everything here as it is." Abigail heard this and paused for a moment. When the other 2 had gone, she turned back. "You don't need to speak for me," she said. Her voice wasn't harsh but clear. Jacob was slightly taken aback. "I just wanted—" "I know," Abigail interrupted softly, "but I prefer to speak for myself when necessary." Jacob was silent for a moment. "You're right," he replied. "I was in a hurry." There was no debate, no lengthy explanations. The adjustment happened right there. That afternoon, Jacob returned to the south warehouse and called the 2 workers over. "If you need anything regarding the house," he said, "you should ask Abigail directly. No emphasis, no apology in front of anyone. Just restoring order." Abigail watched from a distance. She didn't feel victorious. She felt respected. On another occasion, the adjustment came from Abigail's side. She made it a habit to walk to the farm at the end of the day when the sun was setting, not to check on things, just to deliver a repaired item or bring back some leftover food. Gradually, those trips became more frequent than she realized. One evening when she arrived, Jacob was having a quick meeting with the staff. Seeing Abigail standing at the gate, he nodded but didn't stop. She stood waiting, holding her basket. The meeting lasted longer than expected. The wind was cold. Abigail felt she was standing on a boundary she shouldn't be. When Jacob finished his work, he approached. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't notice the time." Abigail handed over the basket. "It's all right. I only brought a few cakes." Jacob acknowledged her, then looked at her more closely. "You don't need to wear it every day," he said, his voice low. Abigail understood. She nodded. "You're right," she replied. "I won't turn habit into an obligation." Jacob let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't want that either." From that day on, Abigail reduced her outings. Not because she was told to, but because she didn't want her kindness to disrupt the overall harmony. Minor adjustments continue to take place. Jacob was used to asking beforehand, "May I come in?" even if the door was open. Abigail was used to saying no when necessary, "I need some quiet today." No one sees it as a rejection. They see it as maintaining the relationship, like tightening a screw before it loosens completely. One morning, Abigail noticed the small fence at the back was askew. She fixed it herself, hammering in the posts. By afternoon, Jacob saw it. "I can help," he said. Abigail shook her head. "I'm done." Jacob nodded, not trying to do more, not making his presence necessary. Conversely, there were days when Jacob was tired. He would stop by just to say, "I can't talk today." Abigail nodded. I understand. No questions. No explanations. Respect sometimes means not demanding. The town began to see them as a couple in a very natural way. There was no loud gossip, just casual remarks like, "Those two are a good match," or "They understand each other." Abigail listened, but didn't react. Neither did Jacob. They didn't deny it, but they didn't let outside opinions dictate their pace. One Sunday they walked along the stream. The water was clearer and flowed gently. Young grass was visible on both banks. Sometimes I think Abigail said that living close together can easily lead to dependence. Jacob nodded. And sometimes living too far away leads to assumptions. Abigail smiled. So we're in the middle, Jacob chuckled softly. The middle part is the hardest. But it's also the most authentic place, Abigail replied. They stopped and looked at the water. We're going to have more clashes, Jacob said. It's unavoidable. Abigail nodded. As long as we speak out before it gets out of control, Jacob looked at her. And listen before you react. She nodded. Deal. No handshakes, no promises. Just a principle of living in harmony. One rainy evening, Abigail was at home reading. A knock sounded at the door. Taps familiar. Jacob was standing outside, his shirt wet. Excuse me, he said. The drain is clogged. I need to ask you if I can borrow some tools here tomorrow morning. Abigail nodded. Go ahead and take it. Jacob didn't go in. He added, Thank you for being so frank the other day. Abigail smiled. Thank you for listening. He nodded and turned away. Abigail closed the door and returned to her desk. She realized she felt at peace, not because there were no problems, but because the problems had been dealt with at the right time. At the end of the month, they renewed their lease, adjusting a few clauses for clarity. No one found it strange. Adults solidify what they want to keep for the long term. On the day of signing, Jacob picked up the pen, then pushed it towards Abigail. Read it again, he said. Abigail read it carefully, made a small correction and signed it. Done, she said. Jacob nodded. Done. There's no feeling of taking another step forward. There's only the feeling of laying the foundation for a step already taken. That night, Abigail wrote, Walking together isn't about holding hands tighter. It's about learning to let go when necessary, asking questions when unsure, and saying no before kindness becomes a burden. She closed the notebook and blew out the lamp. Outside, the rain had stopped. The moon peeked out from behind the clouds. The path between the small house and the farm was still there, no shorter, no longer, but just wide enough for two people to walk side by side without dragging each other. Summer arrived at Dry Creek quietly. There is no such thing as the first day of summer. It was simply one morning when Abigail Monroe opened her window and realized she no longer needed a light coat. The sun came in earlier. The air was warm and dry. The sounds of town began to stretch out, the chatter on porches, the horses' hooves later in the day, the distant clang of hammers repairing the roof. Life continues at the rhythm it has found for itself. Abigail had lived in the small South house for almost a season. She knew every corner where the sunlight fell on the table in the morning, the sound of the wind whistling through the window in the afternoon, the smell of the earth after the rain. She still worked at the tailor shop, still read in the evenings, still wrote in her old notebook, but no longer did she write to comfort herself. She wrote to record. Jacob Harlan is the same. The farm was running smoothly. The workers were settled. The fence was repaired. The irrigation ditches were clear. There was still plenty of work to be done, but the feeling of uncertainty was gone. He went to town more regularly, not to look for anyone, but because life demanded it. They met more often, but not more than necessary. There were no named dates, no new unspoken agreements, just afternoon walks together, shared meals, when convenient, and prolonged silences that felt unbreakable. And then, on a very ordinary evening, what needed to be said was said. That day, Abigail finished cooking early. The sun hadn't quite set yet. She carried 2 bowls out onto the porch and placed them on the low wooden table. Jacob arrived just in time as usual, not too early, not too late. They ate in silence for a while. It's not that there's nothing to say, it's that there's nothing that needs to be said right now. When he finished eating, Jacob set his bowl down and looked out at the field, which was turning a pale yellow. Abigail, he said. She turned around. Yes, Jacob didn't look at her immediately. He stared straight ahead like someone carefully choosing their words. I think it's time I ask something, he said. Abigail wasn't nervous. She just nodded. Go ahead and ask. Jacob took a deep breath. Would you like, he said slowly, to call this a marriage? No kneeling, no rings, no flowery promises. It's just a question that arises after things have lived long enough. Abigail was silent for a long time. It wasn't because she was hesitant. Rather, she was reviewing her entire journey to ensure that this answer didn't stem from habit, convenience, or a fear of loneliness. She thought of the afternoon on the train when she couldn't get off. She thought of winter, the bridge, the falling snow. She thought of the little house, the clear paperwork, the times she said no and was listened to. She thought of the silences that didn't leave her feeling empty. Then she looked at Jacob. Yes, Abigail said, I want to. Jacob turned to her. His eyes didn't blaze with joy. They were calm, deep, and very real. It's not because I need someone to protect me, Abigail continued, but because I've lived with him long enough to know I don't lose myself here. Jacob nodded. And I don't want you here because of me. He won't have that, she replied. They looked at each other. No smiles, no excessive emotion. Only the confirmation of two adults is required. They weren't in a hurry to tell anyone, not because of concealment, but because there's no need to announce it. They talked about very practical things, what the house would look like, how the money would be, whether Abigail's job would continue. Nothing was left out for fear of ruining the atmosphere. We still have all the paperwork, Abigail said. Jacob nodded. And there's still some personal space. And if one day, she added, we need to say, I need quiet, then we'll say it. Jacob nodded. No reason needed. They agreed on a very simple wedding date. Not a large crowd. No extravagance. Just a small church, a few close friends and family, and a shared meal. Not to mark a beginning, Abigail said, but to acknowledge what has already happened. Jacob smiled slightly. I like the way you talk. The wedding day arrived on a pleasant, sunny morning. Abigail wore a simple dress altered by herself. Jacob wore a clean, neat suit. They stood side by side in the church without trembling or nervousness. When the pastor asked, they answered clearly. Nobody says forever. They say, I choose. After the ceremony, they ate with everyone. They laughed just enough. They talked just enough. No one dragged them into excessive congratulations. In the afternoon, they walked back to their little house. It's not Jacob's house. It's not Abigail's house. It's just a house. The following years passed uneventfully. Dry Creek changes slowly. A few more houses are built. The road is repaired. Children grow up. Old people pass away. Abigail and Jacob lived amidst these changes, neither too conspicuous nor too quiet. They worked. They argued when necessary. They were silent when enough was enough. There were difficult days. There were seasons of loss. But there wasn't a single day they were together because they had no other choice. One evening, many years later, they sat on the porch, a gentle breeze blowing. Abigail said, Do you remember that day on the ship? Jacob nodded. I remember. If he hadn't boarded the ship that day, she said, I might still be alive, but I'm not sure I would be living like this. Jacob gazed into the distance. If I had left that day, he replied, I might have been all right, but I would never know what I missed. They were silent. No regrets. No pride. I'm just grateful that I didn't leave sooner than necessary. Abigail wrote the last line in her old notebook. Not every story needs a climax. Some stories only need one person brave enough to wait, and one person honest enough to step down when they're ready. She folded the notebook and put it in the drawer. Out there, Dry Creek is peaceful. It doesn't promise anything grand, but it's enough to live a full life without regrets. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that quiet choices are the most lasting choices, please like, share, and subscribe to continue following Frontier Hearts, a place where stories are quiet, yet they linger in people's hearts for a long time.